The sound of stars in the dead of night. It was a cold autumn night when John and Emily decided to stay overnight at an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of a small village in Eastern Europe. They had heard the locals whisper about strange occurrences in the mansion, but being passionate travelers and thrill seekers, they dismissed the rumors as just that, rumors. The mansion was located deep within the woods, its crumbling stone walls hidden behind a veil of overgrown ivy and thick trees. As John and Emily arrived, the house loomed ahead like a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. The wooden door creaked as John pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit foyer, where the dust hung thick in the air and the smell of mildew filled their nostrils. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Emily said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Are you sure it's safe?" John grinned. "It's just an old house. Besides, it's part of the adventure, right?" They made their way inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight. The mansion had an eerie, unsettling aura, with its dark hallways and the sound of wind howling through broken windows. Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but she shrugged it off, chalking it up to the atmosphere of the place. As they explored the ground floor, they stumbled upon a grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The staircase was covered in dust, and the ornate banister had long since lost its former grandeur. John hesitated for a moment, but then motioned for Emily to follow. "Let's go upstairs," he said. "This is where all the rumors say the strange things happen." They ascended the staircase slowly, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. When they reached the top, the hallway stretched out before them, with doors leading to dark, empty rooms. At the far end of the hall was a door that seemed to glow faintly, as though something beyond it was emitting a soft, ethereal light. Emily's heart raced. "That one looks different. Should we check it out?" "Why not?" John replied, his curiosity getting the better of him. They approached the door and slowly turned the knob. It creaked open, revealing a room unlike the others. It was small, with only a single window that overlooked the woods. The furniture was old and decayed, but what caught their attention was the strange object in the center of the room. It was an ancient-looking chest, made of dark wood, covered in intricate carvings that looked almost otherworldly. Emily stepped closer to the chest, her fingers brushing against its surface. "This looks out of place. Why would they leave it here?" John, equally intrigued, crouched down beside it. "Let's open it." As John lifted the heavy lid, the temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. A cold, dry gust of wind swept through the room, and both of them froze. The chest was empty, but as they peered deeper into it, a soft sound reached their ears, a faint, melodic hum that seemed to come from somewhere within the walls of the house. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. John's gaze shifted to the walls, where the sound seemed to be coming from. "I don't know, but we should check it out." They moved toward the source of the sound, which led them to a narrow door tucked away in the corner of the room. As John opened the door, a rush of cold air hit them, carrying the strange, haunting melody. It wasn't a song, exactly, but a rhythmic hum, almost like a faraway chant. The room beyond the door was small and dimly lit by a single candle on the floor. The walls were covered in old, faded paintings of stars and strange symbols. At the center of the room was a stone altar, and on the altar lay an object that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. It was a small silver star, hanging from a delicate chain, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Is this what the sound is coming from?" Emily whispered. Before John could answer, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. They both spun around, hearts racing. The room was suddenly darker, and the temperature had dropped even further, causing their breath to fog in the air. Then, as if in response to their fear, the humming grew louder, more intense. It was no longer a distant sound, but now it felt as though it was surrounding them, coming from all directions. Suddenly, the room seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in rhythm with the sound. The star on the altar began to glow brighter, and John could feel an unseen force pulling him toward it. He tried to resist, but it was like his body was moving on its own. "John!" Emily cried out, but her voice seemed distant, as though she were speaking from far away. John's vision blurred as the humming filled his ears, drowning out everything else. He reached out for the star, his hand trembling, and as his fingers brushed against it, the room erupted in a flash of blinding light. When John opened his eyes again, everything had changed. The room was gone. The mansion was gone. The only thing around him was an endless expanse of stars, stretching out into the void. He felt weightless, suspended in the cold, dark emptiness of space. The humming was still there, now louder than ever, and it seemed to be coming from the stars themselves. He turned around, his heart pounding in his chest, and saw Emily standing beside him. But she wasn't the Emily he knew. Her eyes were wide and empty, staring into the abyss. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, John understood. The mansion, the chest, the star, it had all been a trap, a doorway to another dimension, a place where time and space no longer held meaning. The sound of the stars was the sound of those who had been trapped here before them, their souls lost forever, caught in the cosmic hum. And now, they were part of it too. The night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. It was a quiet night at St. Vincent's Hospital, the kind of night where time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Michael, a young pharmacy technician, was working his late-night shift, alone in the back room, surrounded by rows of medicine shelves and medical supplies. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beep from the monitors in the hallways were the only sounds that broke the silence. As the clock struck 2 a.m., Michael was busy organizing some inventory when he heard it. A soft, creaking sound echoed through the hallway outside the pharmacy. A door slowly opening. Michael froze, his hands still on the medication bottles, his heart beginning to race. The hallway outside was empty, or at least it should have been. He stood up and walked toward the door, peering out into the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. No one was there. Shaking his head, he turned back to his work, telling himself it was just the old building settling. But the sound of the door, creaking open, lingered in his mind, a constant echo that wouldn't let go. He tried to push it aside and continued his task, but a strange unease settled over him. Just then, the door at the end of the hallway, a door marked with a warning sign reading "Authorized Personnel Only," creaked open once again. Michael's blood ran cold. The restricted area was off limits to everyone except hospital staff with specific clearance, and no one else should have been there at this hour. A shadow moved across the hallway. Michael squinted into the darkness, his breath catching in his throat. He could make out a figure, a shape, hunched over near the trash bins. It was a person, or at least it seemed to be, but the way they moved was wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were dragging something behind them. Without thinking, Michael stepped forward, slowly approaching the figure. As he got closer, he realized the person was rummaging through the trash, picking up something from the metal bin. The strange thing was the figure was wearing hospital scrubs just like him, but their face was hidden in shadow, and there was something off about the way they moved. It almost looked like they were gliding rather than walking. "Hello!" Michael called out, his voice shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it paused, as if sensing his presence. Michael's pulse quickened, his instincts telling him something was very wrong. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor, but he forced himself to take another step closer. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out. Michael gasped, instinctively reaching for the light switch, but before he could, the figure disappeared into the shadows, as if it had evaporated into thin air. His heart was pounding as he stood there in the darkness. He switched on the emergency flashlight on his phone, the small beam of light cutting through the blackness. The trash bin was overturned, and the contents were scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of the figure. His mind raced. He thought back to something that had happened a few months earlier, an incident that still haunted the hospital's halls. A nurse, someone Michael had known well, was caught stealing drugs from the pharmacy. It had caused a huge scandal, and rumors had swirled that the nurse hadn't acted alone. Some said there had been others, hidden in the shadows, working to cover up their tracks. But Michael wasn't sure what to believe anymore. His gut twisted as he realized the figure he had just seen may not have been a real person at all. Was it a ghost of a nurse who had been fired for theft? Or was there something more sinister going on in the hospital? Something that Michael wasn't prepared to uncover. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for a brief moment, he considered running out of the room and calling for help. But then, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of something scraping against the floor coming from the hallway. The figure had returned. Michael stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound of dragging continued, getting louder, closer. He forced himself to turn and face the hallway, but when he did, there was nothing. Nothing except the empty corridor stretching out before him. Except for one thing. On the floor near the door to the restricted area, there was a small, blood-stained bandage, as if someone had dropped it in haste. It was just like the ones used for the 4 drips, but this one had been torn and discarded carelessly, as though someone had been in a hurry. A cold chill swept through the air, and Michael felt his stomach churn. The figure wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for him to leave. The feeling of being watched intensified, and he suddenly realized he wasn't alone in the room. In the reflection of the window, he saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to send him stumbling backward. The same figure, the one he had seen earlier, was standing right behind him. But this time, the figure was no longer moving slowly. It was standing still, its face completely obscured, its body draped in hospital scrubs that looked stained with dark, almost black marks. "Get out," a whisper hissed in his ear, and Michael spun around, but there was no one there. His breath caught in his throat as the temperature in the room dropped drastically, the air growing heavy with a sense of dread. Panicking, Michael rushed toward the exit, but before he could even touch the door, it slammed shut in front of him with a deafening crash. The lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as if the walls themselves were alive, speaking to him from every direction. "Leave now before it's too late." With every ounce of strength he had left, Michael pushed the door open and ran into the hall, his legs shaky and his heart hammering in his chest. But even as he escaped into the relative safety of the hospital's main corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. The whispers persisted, as did the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for him to make one wrong move. Michael never worked the night shift at St. Vincent's again, and when he left the hospital for good, he never looked back. But the whispers followed him, echoing in his mind every night as he tried to sleep, always reminding him of the things he saw and the things he couldn't explain. The haunted house on Hawthorne Hill. The Thompson family had just moved into their new home, a large, old Victorian house perched atop Hawthorne Hill in the small town of Willowbrook. It was the perfect place for them to start fresh, with a sprawling garden, tall trees, and a sense of quiet isolation that seemed to promise peace. But from the moment they stepped inside, things began to feel wrong. The house had been empty for years before the Thompsons bought it, and the real estate agent had assured them that it was in perfect condition. But as they unloaded boxes and settled into the creaky wooden rooms, strange things began to happen. It started with the doors. The heavy front door would often slam shut by itself, and the windows would open and close without explanation, no matter how tightly they were secured. One evening, as the sun set and darkness crept into the house, young Emma Thompson, who was only 10, sat quietly in the living room, reading her book. She had just heard a soft creak above her, followed by a faint rustling. When she glanced up, her eyes widened in shock. On the opposite side of the room, the large, ornate mirror seemed to shimmer, as if something was moving behind it. Then, for a split second, she saw it, a figure, a pale woman in a long, flowing dress, standing in the reflection. Emma's heart raced. She blinked, and the figure was gone. She rushed upstairs to find her parents. "Mom, Dad," she cried, her voice filled with fear. "I saw a woman in the mirror downstairs." Her parents, initially dismissing her as just imagining things, tried to comfort her. But as the days passed, more strange occurrences unfolded. The family began to hear the sounds of footsteps late at night, soft but deliberate, echoing through the empty hallways. It wasn't just the sound of creaky floorboards. These footsteps were unmistakably human, as if someone was walking through the house when no one was there. The family tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling, but the events grew more unsettling. One night, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Jason, the father, found an old journal wedged between two dusty crates. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, and the handwriting inside was barely legible. The journal spoke of a tragic history, how the house had once belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hawthorne, who had mysteriously vanished many years ago. According to the journal, Eleanor had been a beautiful but reclusive woman who lived in the house alone. Neighbors whispered that she had been involved in strange rituals and that she had a dark secret hidden within the walls of her home. One night, she was seen walking into the forest behind the house, but she never returned. After that, rumors spread that her spirit haunted the house, searching for something or someone. Jason was unnerved by the journal, but it wasn't until he found a hidden compartment in the attic under the floorboards that the story took an even darker turn. Inside the compartment was a small, ornate box covered in strange symbols. When he opened it, he found a picture of Eleanor, along with an old locket containing a lock of hair. The photo was blurry, but her eyes were unmistakably piercing, as if staring directly at him. The room grew colder, and the air seemed to thicken around him. It felt like someone was watching him, just behind his shoulder. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, the house felt different. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the air was dense, heavy with an unexplainable tension. As they sat at the table, the lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway once again. But this time, they were louder, more urgent. Emma screamed from the upstairs hallway, her voice sharp with terror. "Mom! Dad! There's someone in my room!" The family rushed up to find her standing in the corner of her room, trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she pointed toward the mirror. In the reflection, they saw it, Eleanor, standing in the same long dress, her face twisted with rage and sorrow. "We have to leave," Jason said, his voice trembling. "This house is not safe." But before they could pack, strange things escalated. The walls seemed to close in on them. The air became thick and suffocating, and eerie whispers began to drift through the house. The whispers were unintelligible at first, but soon Jason could make out words. "Leave, the curse, never leave." Desperate to understand the full story, the family visited the local library the next morning, hoping to find more information about Eleanor and the house. The librarian, a frail old woman named Mrs. Green, seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. She led them to a dusty section in the back of the library, where a faded newspaper clipping revealed the shocking truth. Eleanor hadn't disappeared. She had been murdered. The article described how Eleanor had been found dead in the house, her body discarded in the attic. Her death had been covered up, and the house was sold in secrecy. The local authorities had believed the murder to be a tragic accident, but as it turned out, Eleanor's spirit had been bound to the house in death, searching for justice. But that wasn't all. Eleanor had been involved in a dark ritual, one that was meant to bind her soul to the house forever. Her anger, her sorrow, and the unresolved mystery of her death were now fueling the hauntings. The Thompsons couldn't stay any longer. That night, they packed their things and left, but not before they heard Eleanor's voice one last time, whispering from the shadows, "You cannot escape me." As they drove away, the house on Hawthorne Hill loomed behind them, dark and silent. The cursed house would wait for the next family to move in, to experience its terror, its sorrow, and its rage. The story of Eleanor was far from